Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time today to view our webinar sponsored by Simon's VIP Connect titled Understanding and Identifying Executive Functioning Deficits. My name is Kara Foltz, and I am one of the study coordinators for the Simon's VIP Connect study, and I am joined today by Dr. Cora Taylor, a pediatric psychologist and clinical investigator at the Autism and Developmental Medicine Institute at Geisinger Health System. During this presentation today, Dr. Taylor will discuss executive functioning. She will define the term, explain how executive functioning affects academic and adaptive skills, and teach participants how to assess for executive functioning deficits. Following the presentation, we invite you to submit any questions you have for Dr. Taylor by emailing the Simon's VIP Connect coordinator. This email is found on our website as well, and that's coordinator@simonsvipconnect.org. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Cora Taylor. Dr. Taylor is a licensed clinical psychologist and researcher at the Autism and Developmental Medicine Institute, part of Geisinger Health System. She completed her doctorate at the School of Psychology at the University of Tennessee and a postdoctoral fellowship at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Dr. Taylor has experience evaluating children from birth through adulthood for a range of developmental disabilities and provides treatment to children and adolescents with autism spectrum disorder. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Taylor, and you can go ahead and get started.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be talking today about executive functioning deficits because I think it's truly something that goes beyond just one specific disorder and allows us to think about how some of these what we know about executive functioning actually affects very broadly. So I'll start out by just talking about what executive functioning disorder is. And I was really privileged last week to actually see someone else speak on executive functioning disorder, and her name was Dr. Denkla at the Kennedy Krieger Institute of Johns Hopkins. And I thought she really said something that was brilliant. You know, she said it's not she called it the automobile model of executive functioning, and that executive functioning is not what's under the hood of the car. That's your potential. But it's the things that are in the car that make it go and make it stop and make it drive. So executive functioning are the brakes and the steering wheel that you use. Maybe it's your mirrors to look around and see what else is going on in your environment. So it's not your potential, but really how you use some of your skills and your processing. So like I say here, it really is a set of distinct skills that helps us to interact with our world in a positive way. We do know about it in that it's brain-based, and it's part of some of the control that comes from our frontal cortex, which is sort of the higher thinking area of the brain. And it's involved in a lot of things. So if you hear things like self-regulation, self-control, understanding your own behavior, making judgments about things, those are all words that kind of cue you that what we're really talking about is executive functioning. So when thinking about the children that we work with, how do our students use these skills, and what are the different components of executive functioning? There's lots of different things that go into executive functioning, so I'll just go through some examples of what those are. So first we have inhibition. That's our impulse control. That's our ability to edit, or our edit button, our ability to stop ourselves before we say something that we maybe otherwise shouldn't say. Shifting is very important, especially when we think about higher levels of academic performance, when we have to go between classes. So we have to transition between ideas, people, places. We monitor our own behavior and can adapt our behavior to different environments. Emotional regulation, so being able to control extreme reactions, being able to take the perspective of another person and understand where their side might be coming from. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Being able to even initiate an activity can be a part of executive functioning. So if you're very disorganized and executive functioning skills aren't well developed, you might have trouble even just starting a task. Working memory, that's kind of, you call it maybe your scratch pad. So it's everything that you can hold in your mind at one time that lets you be successful on a task. I think about this a lot in like math class when we're doing long division or any kind of problem that requires us to remember a lot of steps about what we're supposed to do next. And we're supposed to hold all of those things in our mind at the same time and use them in a way that we can remember. So that's our scratch pad. Being able to plan and organize our own behavior, thinking ahead, identify what do we even need to bring so that we can be successful at our next class. Or what time do I need to start getting ready if I want to be at school by 8? Or if I want to go to the pool at 1, what do I need to get? What time do I need to start? What time do we need to leave? Those are all things about planning and organizing that are an important part of executive functioning. Organization of materials. So kind of have the classic example of looking into certain children's lockers, and you can kind of tell which ones are put together and well organized and which ones maybe need a little bit of help figuring out where things might go and how to keep everything orderly. And then finally, a really advanced executive functioning is being able to self-monitor. And if we think about this in an academic way, we can say, am I on track with the rules? Am I following the rubric? So looking at what I've done and comparing it to a standard about what I know that I am supposed to be doing. But also self-monitoring can be something that we do just in everyday life. So that it really goes along with all of these other things, being able to really think about thinking and think about our own organization. And so why do these skills matter, right? What impact do they really have? We talk about so many other types of deficits that kids might have that are important, like social skills deficits and how important that is for things like job interviews, or intellectual deficits, or academic learning disabilities. So how does executive functioning play into all of this, and why should we really care about executive functioning? So one is school success. If you can't keep yourself organized in a way that is understandable and that you can remember, it's really difficult to complete some of the complex academics that happen not just in middle school or high school, but also as kids who go on to college. Being able to monitor your own behavior and keep yourself on track is really important. If you think about kids who might be going on to college who have executive functioning deficits, that's when we often see those kids really start to struggle, because in high school and middle school you often have a little bit of structure that's built in for you, but once you move on to college and you're expected to manage your own behavior, your own social life, your own classes without a whole lot of structure and prompting about when you need to start your end of semester project in order to get it done on time, then that's really impactful on your ability to do well in those classes. Also, just general skills for independence play into executive functioning. So if you think about cooking a recipe and being able to make sure that you do everything in the right order and planning ahead for things that you need to do. So I many a time have forgotten to read a recipe from front to back before I started making it, or if I did read it, I completely forgot that I really needed to go ahead and take the butter out of the fridge so that it wouldn't be stone cold when I went to actually cook it or put it in my dish. So being able to hold all that information in your mind at once, planning, I think, a big Thanksgiving dinner is just the ultimate test of executive functioning. I, for one, really struggle with trying to get everything in the oven at the right time so it will all come out at the same time. That is a huge executive functioning demand, to multitask recipes, understand when things need to go in the oven or on the stove, not burn anything, not undercook anything, and get everything together at the same time is tough. We also use those skills for driving. So, we really have to monitor our own behavior while also paying attention to really what's going on around us, understanding the intentions of what other people are doing. I've already discussed a little bit about college, but employment can be the same, especially if we think about getting into a manager type position, or thinking about generally when we have a job, we don't just have one job that we're supposed to do or one thing that we have to do every day. We have to manage lots of different responsibilities and tasks. So being able to think about what tasks am I required to do today, what steps do I need to do to get those tasks, and being able to prioritize the different things that you need to get done. Making good decisions is really built into that as well. So we've kind of already talked about a little bit about that. Building positive relationships. I think I discussed on the last slide, emotional regulation is part of executive functioning, being able to inhibit and hit that stop button or that edit button when you might be inclined to say something that you otherwise shouldn't say or something that you otherwise don't mean. And regulating behavior. So minimizing that high-risk behavior. We think about individuals with executive functioning deficits as being very impulsive and having a hard time regulating their own behavior, so they seem to be more likely than other individuals to engage in high-risk behaviors. They tend to have higher rates of teen pregnancy and drug use than individuals who have more well-developed executive function. So, and I built some of this into the last slide, but how does executive function affect school performance? So we really can see it across the board. So thinking about reading, being able to actually understand and integrate information together is a part of that. So we might be able to read the words, but if we can't think about the broader picture at the same time and integrate that with other readings that we may have done or what we already know, that makes it really difficult to perform in reading and to be able to answer comprehension. And again, difficulty recalling information that has been read. And then when we give longer reading assignments, really hard times being able to regulate behavior so that you can stay on task with reading. And across other school performance areas, we find kids who struggle with executive functioning needing to have more frequent breaks, especially with tasks that tend to be more long or more arduous to complete. In terms of writing, you might have a lot of trouble organizing their own thoughts. So you have a prompt and they might be sort of on the prompt but making tangential comments about things that maybe aren't quite related, or putting their arguments in the wrong order as opposed to going about the writing assignment in a really systematic way that builds from beginning to end. And then also some children, like I said, tangential comments and just having a hard time staying on the prompt and understanding what they're supposed to be answering. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about being able to follow a rubric. So we can also see these executive functioning deficits in areas of math. I think I talked to you a little bit earlier about long division. So we might have a child who remembers all the steps but maybe puts them in the wrong order. Or on the other side of that, we might see children who remember some of the steps but might forget a really important step in the middle, like bringing numbers down in long division. Word problems that require not just being able to read the problem, but then understand it and then figure out what is the best way to move forward with this. Also being able to ignore irrelevant facts and just be identify and pick up on what's the most important part of this information. Also might find that they have difficulty with doing fast facts. So a lot of times we have kids who do these, sheets of multiplication problems, and they might have a hard time getting through some of those things because of difficulty attending and ignoring anything irrelevant that might be going on around them. So what do we know about executive functioning over time? So we do know that executive functioning is developmental. So it builds across the lifetime. So this is just a somewhat oversimplified graph about how the building of executive functioning skill proficiency. So this is just not what skills you have necessarily, but just how good you are implementing them. And I'll show you a little bit more about specific skills and how they develop throughout the lifespan. But you'll see here that kids at that young age, you see age 0, age 1, even kids at age 1 do start to develop some early signs of executive functioning skills, but they really start picking up once we think about early grade school years, and then they peak up at between 25 and 29. And I've always kind of thought that was interesting, that that's kind of the same time where we think about having less accidents in cars. So we have car insurance rates drop. People who are about age 25 are now allowed to rent cars. They're considered to be less of a liability or less of a risk. And I think that executive functioning certainly plays a big piece in that. So if we break things down a little bit and think about why, or rather how these things develop. So in early childhood, and by early I mean as young as 9 or 10 months, we can see some children develop these really basic or executive functioning skills like inhibition. And I think the classic example of inhibition is the marshmallow test. But thinking about even earlier, when a child can understand the word no or wait and is actually able to stop themselves, that is some of that inhibition, that waiting that they can understand. But the marshmallow test, if you haven't seen it, it's a very famous example of very young children and their ability to wait for a reward or inhibit their behavior. So essentially the way the test is run is a child is put into a room with a nice, yummy-looking marshmallow, and they're told that they could eat the marshmallow now if they want. But if they wait, usually just a few minutes, about 5 minutes, although I don't believe they told the children how long they were going to wait. But if they waited, then when the researcher came back, the adult came back to the room, they would get 2 marshmallows. But if they chose to eat the marshmallow now, they just got the 1. But if they were able to wait, they got 2. So the adult leaves the room and leaves the child alone with the marshmallow, and usually a bell, which they can ring to signify that they give up and they don't want to wait for the second marshmallow, they just want that 1 marshmallow right now. So that marshmallow test is actually really fascinating about some of those long-term outcomes that we were talking about. So being able to inhibit a behavior and delay reward is huge. And we actually find that those children have much poorer outcomes in terms of health outcomes, drug use, teen pregnancy, like we were talking about earlier, than those children who are actually able to delay their reward. So then other early skills that we might see in really young kids is just early working memory. And my example of that is being able to follow directions that have more than one step. So the earliest piece of this is, steps that have, or directions that have 2 steps, but they're related. So go get the ball and bring it to me. So that's really early. They can go get the ball and bring it, but even having examples of kids who are able to follow multi-step directions that are not related, or go get me your shoes and bring that book over here. So being able to do those 2 things, that's even harder, but we can see early working memory in some younger kids who are able to do that. Now, the thing about executive functioning in early childhood is that even though they might have some of these skills, they might not be very good at actually doing them when it's expected. They likely need lots of reminders and specific supports. So they might know exactly what they need to do because they can remember it all, but they're not able to necessarily organize their own behavior in a way that lets them do that effectively. When we move on to middle childhood and adolescence, we do start developing more skills. So then after that, we can see that children and adolescents are able to organize their own things. They can organize their spaces in ways that make sense. They start to be able to plan their own behavior and plan a timeline out, so keep an agenda or keep a schedule. They can also start planning ahead and coming up with strategies about how to get through a certain task that might be difficult. And so at this point, they might have some more understanding about when they need to use these skills, because they are able to organize and plan and come up with ideas about how to move forward. And so at this point, it's a little bit easier to differentiate between children who have true executive functioning deficits, because at that young age, many children they might have the skills, but they can't really show us that that they had those skills without support. So lots of children are going to need a lot of support in early childhood. So it becomes much easier to really parse out those children with true deficits versus those children without deficits once we get to this stage where there's more skills and children can use the skills more independently. So this is the bad news. Executive functioning peaks really in your 20s, with the most advanced skills being metacognition, which just means being able to really think about thinking. So that's where I talked earlier about self-assessment and self-monitoring your own behaviors. So understanding how you're affecting the world. That's really the top. There is a slow but steady decline, just like you could see in the graph that I showed you a couple slides ago, that starts in the early 30s. So as adults get older, what they find is that they need to use more strategies to help them remember. So a lot of these go to some of the working memory skills. So it might be that in your 20s you could really remember everything that you were supposed to do that day without any difficulty, but now in early 30s and 40s and 50s we find that maybe we rely more on our planner. So I hear lots of adults saying, well, my planner is my life. I don't know what I would do if I lost it. We wouldn't be able to remember anything that was in it. Having to write information down as opposed to just being able to absorb and remember, and increased difficulty with doing multiple things at one time. So having a hard time remembering everything that you need to get done and switching tasks less efficiently as we get older. So when we think about assessing these skills, it's really important to think about what is going on in the context, as opposed to just thinking about the child who is struggling. So is this a behavioral issue? Is this a refusal? It's a can't do or won't do kind of situation. So in can't do, we think about it being much more of a skill deficit. So the situation's requirements are too high and the child cannot meet the expectations. In a won't do situation, we think about the child's behavior as being much more in line with having the skills but not utilizing them, or not utilizing them in the right situations. Sometimes that can even be task refusal. What are the current expectations, and are they realistic for this specific child? And moving forward, what goals should we set in order to help this child be successful and move forward and gain skills? What's the motivation for this child? So if the child isn't necessarily motivated to complete this task, that goes back to a won't do situation. And then what supports do we need to build in? So like we talked about earlier, for those younger kids, we might need to build in from the get-go a lot more supports for them. So talking a little bit about how these things overlap, it's important to consider what diagnoses the child carries, maybe other than your concerns about executive functioning. So we want to ask, does the student have an autism spectrum disorder? Do they have an intellectual disability or ID? Do they have a specific language impairment? Is there anxiety involved? Is there ADHD? Does the child have an oppositional defiant or conduct disorder diagnoses? You can certainly have executive functioning deficits without a specific other diagnoses, but often some of these diagnoses kind of hang out with each other, in that we see children, and I'll talk more about this later, with ADHD generally having significant executive functioning deficits. We also see that co-occurring in autism spectrum disorders. We see it sometimes in anxiety disorders. So we really want to evaluate what are all the concerns that are going on in this situation, and not just isolating it to executive functioning, because often we find that there's more complex things going on. So just to take you through a few of these, how does autism and executive functioning overlap? So might have some trouble integrating data into a big picture. So we sometimes think of our children with autism as being really hyper-focused on details and having a hard time putting all of that together to see something bigger. Being able to maintain and shift attention and working memory. So here's a quote that I liked. I cannot hold one piece of information in my mind while I manipulate the next step in the sequence. So just being able to integrate those steps in a way that makes sense. We also see some of our kids having that really hyper-focus and hypo-focus almost. So only spending really brief amounts of time on certain tasks, but on certain tasks, then it's almost impossible for preferred activities to pull their attention away from that. Theory of mind really goes into executive functioning. So that's being able to think about what you can see and think about what other people are able to see and put those all together to understand how other people might think about a situation. So really the classic example of theory of mind, or the classic test for theory of mind, is putting a child in a room and showing them a box of crayons and asking, well, what do you think is in this box of crayons? And most of the time the child will say, well, there's probably crayons in there. And if you open it up and you dump it out and it's candy, and then you put it back in and seal it up and give it to the child. And so then you bring in another person to the room. It could be, a doll, or it could be a real person, and say, what do you think this person thinks is in that box of crayons? And children who do not have good theory of mind will say that that other person thinks there's candy in the box of crayons, because even what they don't understand is that not everyone knows the information that they know. And then again, difficulty recognizing emotions in others, but also difficulty managing some of their own emotions. So moving on to ADHD, executive functioning deficits, like I mentioned earlier, are generally present in ADHD, but they're not diagnostic. They can certainly occur outside of ADHD. And here are the ones that we think of as really classically involved with ADHD. So we think about impulse control, so just being very impulsive and acting on that first inclination. Being highly disorganized, so we think about the desk of a typical child who maybe has ADHD as just being lots of papers that are crumpled. Not everything is necessarily in its neat pencil box like you would expect it to be. Having trouble shifting topics in conversations in particular. So if you think about having a back and forth of a child with ADHD, they might have trouble changing the topic if you try to change it. So if we're talking about Superman and now we're going to talk about something different, maybe something a little less motivating, they might have trouble going along with that shift. But on the opposite side of that, we also see children having trouble sometimes staying on topic. So they might make a comment that doesn't seem related at all to us as to what we were talking about. Problems with time management, so understanding how long something's going to take. And I think that sometimes can be a bit of a double deficit for children with ADHD, because if they judge how long it might take based on how long it takes other people, if they have trouble staying on task, it actually might take them a little bit longer, given that they might need some increased breaks. Not completing tasks and not planning ahead. Like we talked about earlier with math word problems, having trouble understanding what pieces of information are important and what pieces of information are not important. And finally, trouble remembering verbal directions. I think one of the biggest educational modifications that we talk about with children with ADHD is written instruction and places where they can reference and re-reference the instructions that they're supposed to be paying attention to. So thinking about anxiety. So children with anxiety might be a little bit, and adults too, might be a little bit trickier in that they might have strong executive function skills in a situation that is not anxiety provoking. But then when you put them in a situation that increases anxiety, then using those executive functioning skills becomes a bit of a deficit. So if they have to do some test taking or complete a large project, we might see these children having trouble staying on task during test taking. They might be very slow to finish or have incomplete assignments because the anxiety interferes with their ability to focus attention. Sometimes we also see highly anxious children called procrastinators. and that they never start the project. And sometimes for some children it actually can be related to anxiety about starting the task, anxiety about getting everything right and doing it properly is not uncommon. In children with intellectual disabilities, we'll see that children with ID are much more likely to show executive functioning ability that is closer to their developmental age rather than their chronological age. So the question kind of becomes there, is that truly an executive functioning deficit? Because it might be at their potential. Now that said, we do see children who will have intellectual disability but will also have executive functioning skills that are much lower than what we would expect given their developmental age. So here's just some quick little quotes about when should you suspect executive functioning deficits. So these are the types of things that I think you might hear from teachers or you hear from parents when children have problems with executive functioning. So one being that he just makes silly mistakes. So skipping to not finishing the problem almost is a silly mistake. So something that you know that he's capable of and that he can do, but just seems to skip over without explanation. Having to tell children multiple times that they need to start before they actually begin. Claiming that the child doesn't follow directions. So that goes back to that question that you have to think about, is this a can't do situation or a won't do situation? So children who don't follow directions, there might be multiple things going on. It might be that they are engaging in some defiant behavior, but it also might be executive functioning problems. Going back to the one I skipped, starting the work but never finishing it, so not quite getting to the end, losing everything, showing frustration if they're given too many things at one time. So sometimes we see kids with executive functioning deficits, if they get a huge piece of paper with tons of problems on it, it gets to be really overwhelming and really difficult for those children to get through. And so even if you were to cut that sheet in half and just give them half of it and then get a little break and then get half of it, you might find that they're more successful. And then, like we've talked about a few times, not being able to remember the steps to things that they're supposed to do. So what about executive functioning disorders? This is a question I think we get a lot from parents or families about what is that and could my child maybe have an executive functioning disorder. And you'll probably note I put executive functioning disorder in quotes, and you'll also probably notice that I haven't been calling it that throughout this webinar. I've been calling them executive functioning deficits. And the important thing to note about that is that executive functioning as a disorder is not recognized in the medical field as being something separate and distinct and unique. We generally think about these executive functioning deficits and problems as going along with some of these other diagnoses. So as soon as if I hear somebody say they have an executive functioning disorder, my biggest question or my biggest concern really immediately goes to either some type of intellectual concern, some type of ADHD concern as well. And sometimes we'll see children with learning disabilities appearing to have executive functioning deficits because the work is too difficult. So I really have a lot more questions than answers, I think, when people use the word executive functioning disorder, because in isolation, I have not really seen nothing else going on but this executive functioning deficits for most kids. I think we often have to think about what else is going on for this child and what's going on in the context that might be making this child present in this way. So I would just be cautious about using that term. I hear it more in the schools than we do in the medical side of things, but just important to be aware of that. So our next area that we'll kind of shift to for the rest of the presentation is how do we assess executive functioning? So there's a few different ways that we can do that. There are some direct measures and report-based measures that I'll talk to you about just a couple of, but it's also important like we've talked about a few times across this presentation, is to make sure that we examine executive functioning in multiple environments. So if a child is able to complete a complex writing task about science and something that they're very interested in, and it's coherent and it's well done and beautiful, but then in a different area they're not able to do that, that's when I'm a little more suspicious about something different going on between those two situations. Like I said, it's really how you use your skills. And we don't expect to see that you have really strong executive functioning in math, but then really poor executive functioning in writing. So we just want to make sure that we're really fully evaluating the situations. But then also, are there situational specific aspects to executive functioning? So we talked about that children who have anxiety can sometimes maybe get a little bit overloaded. So it's not a simple question to ask. But there are some good things that we can do to start looking at executive functioning. So just to start out, and we talked earlier in younger children about executive functioning and how it's difficult to assess in really young kids because it might not be that they don't have the skills, but it might just be that they haven't quite learned how to use them effectively yet. But sometimes what we can see in younger children that are some of those early red flags is that kind of motor overflow. So we see kids who are really active, having trouble sitting still. We've all kind of seen this in a really young child who seems to be, that early developmental stage that might seem to develop into kind of an ADHD or hyperactive type presentation. So the one checklist that I'll talk about, because it is pretty widely used, is the brief. So there's a few different versions. It does go down to preschool, which is a benefit in that we can actually compare preschoolers to other preschoolers, which can be difficult to do by just looking at them. And then it has school-age and adult versions. In older individuals, there is self-report, but we also can compare teacher report and parent report. So it has a lot of different aspects there. So we have inhibition, being able to shift between different tasks, having good emotional control. It has measures of working memory, planning and organizing behavior, but also planning and organizing materials, and then that self-monitoring component that we talked about. It's able to show if children have strengths in certain areas of executive functioning, but also is able to pick up on weaknesses that children have in executive functioning. The only caution that I do put out with some of these checklists is they haven't been well researched in children who also have other developmental concerns. So they may be really excellent at identifying children with specific executive functioning types of deficits if they also have typical development. But in children with autism spectrum disorder or intellectual disability, these checklists are not as good as picking up where the lines, can we draw the lines between children who maybe this is sort of goes along with having an intellectual disability or children don't. So in that vein, I just want to emphasize what the importance of having a cognitive assessment is in evaluating executive functioning deficits. So really, if you just have a measure of executive functioning, but you don't know what their developmental level is, it doesn't give you any context with which to interpret that information. So all we know is that maybe they have trouble with planning, but is it because they really have trouble across the board in their developmental skills? When you do cognitive assessment, though, you can get a lot of really good information about executive functioning. So we often see children with executive functioning maybe doing quite well or average in things like verbal and nonverbal skills, but then showing a big gap between that and their working memory skills and their processing speed skills. So looking for those specific types of deficits in those two areas can be helpful. But also just testing observations. So when, if the school psychologist or another evaluator is testing a child, they might talk about how the child makes really tangential comments. So not being able to say, during testing, maybe all of a sudden out of nowhere started talking about their dog, or other things happened when they were supposed to be really on task, or they were told that they needed to really focus and pay attention. These children probably need a lot more prompting to get back to work. They might have a lot of self-correction. So you might see that if a child has an executive functioning deficit and you give them a problem to solve, they might answer immediately, but then once they wait for a minute, they'll change it. So they give a very impulsive answer to start, but they actually do know the answer if you give them more time. They might need frequent breaks. So if you're in a long task, or it's going to be 30, 45 minutes to an hour of sitting, they might need breaks every 10, every 15 minutes in order to do their best. And finally, hearing instructions multiple times is fairly common to see when children are doing something like a cognitive assessment. But also you can see that in their other school areas. There are some other direct testing that can be done specifically for executive functioning deficits. So there is the Dennis Kaplan Executive Function System, which can be used in children who are as young as age 8 through as old as age 89. So we can really span a broad age range. And this is nice in that you actually get more direct assessment of the executive functioning. So instead of where we're just observing, or we're doing something else and trying to collect executive functioning information, or we're just asking parents or asking teachers, this type of assessment actually lets us look at the child and try to elicit some of those executive functioning skills to see when we put them in a really specific situation and expect them to use these skills, are they able to show them to us? Another common one that you'll see, especially when we're looking at children being diagnosed with ADHD, is they might be asked to do something called a continuous performance test. It's usually a computer-based assessment where children are supposed to just pay good attention and kind of respond maybe by hitting a button every time they see a certain letter or every time something specific happens. Of thinking about executive functioning as sustained attention, but also to some extent for some of these tasks it can be a little bit of inhibition and not just hitting the space bar or hitting a button every time some event happens. I think another classic example that that we can think about with executive functioning is what we call the Stroop test. And it's kind of fun, which is why I put it up here, but the Stroop test involves looking at pictures of words that are colored in different colors. And in this version, you probably would find it pretty easy, because what I would ask you to do is to tell me what color the word is written in. So for this one, they match, so it's pretty easy. You could easily say red, black, yellow, purple, green, blue. But the way the Stroop test is actually difficult is that we switch it up. And so we ask children for this one, we would actually want them to say purple, red, black, yellow, blue, green. Those would be the correct answers. But that takes a really significant amount of inhibition, so being able to stop yourself from just reading the word and kind of shifting your attention to the color and instead producing that word instead. So like we've talked about a little bit throughout this, assessment of executive functioning deficits specifically can be really hard. There's a lot of variability in scores. So if you gave a child a cognitive assessment, which would be an integral part, and took very good behavior observations, or a psychologist took great behavior observations, you might not get the same answers that seem to be present on the parent or teacher rating forms. You might see that the parent and teacher see the child really differently, which can be hard to reconcile about what really might be going on in those situations. We also know that executive function can be really influenced by other things that are going on in the environment. So, for example, having other children around in the room who might be talking could be something that really affects your ability to stay on task and to pay attention. So I think it's really important to think about this needing to be measured on an optimal day and an optimal setting in order to truly understand what the child's executive functioning skills are. And that's almost an impossible request. And even if you could achieve that, to assess optimal skills in an optimal setting on the optimal day, that might not really reflect how the child actually functions in the day-to-day environment. So I'll conclude there, and just another note that you can certainly send us questions via email if you want to follow up on any of the things that I've talked about in today's presentation.
And thank you again, Dr. Taylor, and thanks to everyone for viewing our webinar. Please remember that if you would like to submit any questions for Dr. Taylor, feel free to email us at coordinator@simonsvipconnect.org. Thank you.